All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. This is a gathering of Capitol Hill United Ministries, which I think most of you know very well what that is, but CHUM is an interfaith organization comprised of congregations and faith-based service agencies in Denver's Capitol Hill neighborhood and beyond. There's no stopping Deanna. She's getting us reaching further and further out. CHUM's mission is to be a spiritual presence and resource in the inner city of Denver, to practice hospitality, advocate for our neighbors in need, and strengthen and sustain our member communities through effective communication, cooperation, enhancing the ministry of all. And as you know very well, the Women's Homelessness Initiative is also a program of CHUM. This year, CHUM is kicking off a program called How Can We Fix It? We know so many in our community have been feeling and witnessing the tragedies of our society, and both in the past, the present, and things that we can see that are to come. And as our hearts have been opened, educated, angered, frustrated, pain, paralyzed, and more, we are looking this year to see what are some small ways that we can make a difference, that we can fix things or have grow toward the light going forward. Today, our program is on Negro spirituals and a small movement toward reparations. We have two wonderful speakers who are with us this morning, Harold Fields and Adam Waite. Harold has been active in racial and restorative justice work for decades and was the national training director for the documentary Traces of the Trade. He facilitated the monthly Second Tuesday Race Forum for 23 years and served on the board of the Denver Foundation for 6 years. Harold sang with the Spirituals Project Choir for 13 years and was its music librarian. Currently, Harold is the chair of the Denver Black Reparations Council. Adam Waite is the Minister of Music at Montview Boulevard Presbyterian Church, where he oversees the church's broad musical and artistic programming, as well as conducts the 80-voice Westminster Choir at Montview. As a composer and arranger, his commissioned works have been performed by the Colorado Symphony Orchestra and Chorus, the Metropolis Symphony, and the folk supergroup I'm With Her. He has written for over 40 different Broadway casts as music supervisor and director for Broadway Carols for a Cure. His orchestral work, The Tool Collector, was heralded by the LA Times for its use of minimalist texture while seamlessly contrasting symphonic strings with jazz horns. And his reimagined score to Dave Brubeck's To Hope was premiered at St. Peter's Church prestigious Jazz Vespers. If you haven't caught it already, you may want to check out an interview Adam did with NPR for Weekend Edition, where he spoke about the Reparations royalty pilot program called Sing. And in the interview titled Some White Congregations Are Paying to Use Hymns Written by Enslaved African People, he spoke about how Montview, along with other congregations, organizations, and music venues can be involved. Welcome, Adam and Harold. And I think this next part of our presentation, Harold will take over, talking about the history and context of spirituals.
Well, thank you, Sonia, so much for that introduction. And I'm glad to see all of you. A couple of familiar faces. Peggy, it's good to see you. Haven't seen you in a couple of years. And Holly also as well. So I feel like I'm not a stranger here because I got to know Adam a little bit in the last couple of days and Sonia just now. So I think we'll have a great conversation. So let me see if I can do this and bring up. And hopefully, you are seeing, is everybody seeing that?
Looks good, Harold.
Okay, very good, very good. I think it's first helpful to be clear about the definition of spirituals, what they are and why they were organically created. The spirituals are sacred songs created and first sung by enslaved Africans in North America. Some of the things that are in that category are songs like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Joshua at the Battle of Jericho, Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child, Go Down Moses, Steal Away to Jesus, Didn't My Lord Deliver Daniel, Wade in the Water. These are things many of you have heard and probably sung before. They proliferated in the 18th and 19th centuries. They're rhythmical and improvisational with easy to remember phrases. Many spirituals had a call and response structure with back and forth exchanges between the leader and the group. Most often they were sung a cappella. Their voices and hands were the instruments, and sometimes their feet and their hearts the metronomes. The original composers of the spirituals are unknown. These songs migrated from one plantation to another as people were sold off. The song served many different functions within the slave community. This involved being used for to synchronize movements, but always were central to the struggle for freedom. Now, some people may get them confused with gospels. Gospel music originated in the 1920s in Northern Black churches. They were usually used for worship and sung primarily by choirs and soloists. Gospels have more complex melodies, extensive instrumentation. They fuse musical elements of both the spirituals and the blues and incorporate extensive musical improvisation with piano, guitar, and other instrument accompaniment. Composers of gospels are known and acknowledged. For example, Thomas Dorsey wrote, "Precious Lord, take my hand." He attended the historic Pilgrim Baptist Church in Chicago. This song was a very favorite of Dr. King. Of course, gospels are focused on the Bible and praising Jesus, but they were not used for escape. Now, there are some performance styles that allow people to sing spirituals with a gospel style. But it's important to remember that spirituals are the roots, the foundation for the blues, jazz, gospel, and hip hop music. Now, there's been a concert tradition that was made popular by the Fisk Jubilee Singers. Here's an example of that tradition sung by the Spirituals Project Choir at the University of Denver Newman Center in November 2012. That choir was a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational choir of 80 voices at the time. So let's take a listen. of the differences you might notice between this rendition and Gospels is the use of 4-part harmony: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Our choir often performed arrangements in 8-part harmony. Gospels are usually just soprano, alto, and tenor. In my own mind, this minimizes the sound of the Black male voice as well as their role in society. And people, when they hear a full choir with a strong bass, it's an experience that takes them to a place they hadn't been before. In this song, you could see evidence of coded messages in the lyrics. Ain't gonna lay my religion down. So the white slave master would naturally interpret this as a loyalty to the form of Christianity the enslaved were taught. But it also meant they were not going to give up their African ancestral practices. It's easy to enjoy the spirituals at the level of being just pretty songs that inspire. But as sacred songs of my people, they were much deeper than that. My feeling is that there should always be an explanation of the meaning of a song given to singers and the audience each time songs are sung. And I'm going to share a little of the historical and foundational content needed to honor this music form. I'll show you a few images from my trip with my wife and I took to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC a few years ago. We were fortunate to spend 2 days at the museum shortly after it opened. We know that slavery was critical to the creation of the United States. This slide indicates that by 1860, 4 million enslaved people produced well over 60% of the nation's wealth, and the slave trade valued them at $2.7 billion. This vast wealth affected the entire nation. Enslaved people were the largest single financial asset in the US economy, worth more than all manufacturing and railroads combined. When I worked on the documentary Traces of the Trade, a story from the Deep North, we learned that the whole economy of New England was based on the slave trade, particularly Rhode Island. And Holly Fulton is on this call right now, and she is one of the DeWolf family members that we follow their story. They were from Bristol, Rhode Island. And that family moved more Africans to the Americas than any other family. The whole area was involved in either building ships, making rum, making ropes, financing trips, or even providing insurance for the human cargo. It was as ambiguous then as oil is today. Most people don't know that reparations were paid for slavery, but to the enslavers for the loss of their property. The human cost to Africans was enormous. The average lifetime and the lifespan of enslaved Africans who worked on colonial sugar and rice plantations was only 7 years. After it became illegal to import Africans for slavery, they made us breed to keep the replenishment numbers up. Violence was an everyday reality. Beatings were used as punishment for minor offenses and to warn other Blacks of their possible fate. Those who tried to escape got branded with an R on their foreheads for runner. Subsequent attempts could result in losing an ear or having a tendon in your leg severed. One of the worst practices was to sell off family members and children. My great-grandfather came from Ghana on the northern side of the Pygmy River. After being captured and brought to America, he was sold to a plantation in Missouri. And at the age of 7, he saw his brother being sold away. Now you can understand that one of the main reasons people took chances on the Underground Railroad then was to try and reunite families as well as get to freedom. But getting back to your family members was very important. There are many uses of spirituals. One of these is for inspiration and motivation. In the African storytelling tradition, stories of ancestors, history, victories in battles, and success in overcoming hardships were called upon as inspiration for current challenges. As stories of specific African ancestors faded over time, enslaved Africans adopted heroes from the Christian Bibles as their ancestral equivalents. Noah, the righteous man, protected along with his family from the floods, which destroyed all the evil people on the earth. Daniel, rescued by God from the jaws of the lion. These Africans considered them to be freedom fighters. For example, one of the spirituals called Go Down Moses draws its inspiration from the biblical story of Moses, commanded by God to lead the Hebrew people out of Egyptian bondage. Since Moses was also the name by which the famous Underground Railroad conductor Harriet Tubman was known, the song operates on at least two levels. First, it draws on the biblical story of Moses as a source of inspiration. And secondly, it offers encouragement to the African-American Moses Harriet Tubman and her divinely inspired work. Direct and often veiled protests against injustice were part of the spirituals because they were also used for protest and resistance. Beyond mere inspiration, feelings of moral outrage were expressed through songs. For obvious reasons, many of these songs were not able to survive over time. They were too dangerous to become part of the public domain. So one of the best examples of a protest spiritual is a song called I Got Shoes, but also known as Heaven, Heaven. The veiled lyrics of the song expresses a sense of outrage at the hypocritical behavior of men who had no God-given right to be in the position they occupy. It turns the tables of the oppressor, reversing the power hierarchy. God's children, so-called slaves, have a place in heaven, while the oppressor ain't going there. Now, heaven in spirituals may not necessarily be about life after death. It might simply be life away from the plantation, away from slavery, in the safety of a place in the north, across the Ohio River. And after the Compromise of 1850, when people could be captured and sent back to slavery who had escaped, heaven then moved to Canada. So check out the lyrics. Think about the lyrics. I got a robe, you got a robe, all God's children got a robe. When I get to heaven, gonna put on my robe, gonna shout all over God's heaven, heaven. Everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. God's gonna shout all over God's heaven. And then another verse talks about, I got shoes, you got shoes. They didn't have good coverings for their feet. So it would be heaven to have that. I got a harp, you got a harp, and so on. Now, I'm going to show you how easy it is to trick the brain. Sonia, you can stop the recording right now for a minute. So spirituals kind of had that magical effect because they could use them to talk about escape and other coded communication. One common code of the spirituals were signal songs. In a signal song, a singer or a group of singers communicated code that at a certain event, such as a planned escape from a plantation, was imminent. Messages were coded in the lyrics of the songs. Often direct instructions were given for a particular plan, or escape, or insurrection, or revolt, or a secret worship service. Sometimes they were paired with other secret communication devices like quilts, which would be hung out for days to give people time to memorize some things and some directions. And then the sequence of the quilts would be meaningful to people. But rarely, if ever, was this detected by the slaveholder. As many as 100 to 150,000 enslaved people traveled on the Underground Railroad. Many made it to freedom, but most did not. Even sermons could contain coded messages that a slave owner would not understand. A sermon about the rapture could not necessarily be taken literally. It may be a signal that an escape is coming, and not everybody knows about it. Information was often a problem among the ranks of Black people because there were informants that some slave owners would depend upon to tell them what's going on. So you had to be prepared to run, even if the person working next to you would be left behind, and you had to have that commitment. Examples of spirituals that are generally thought to have functioned during slavery as signal songs include Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Coming for to Carry Me Home. And that meaning was that the Underground Railroad conductor, Harry Tubman, was going to be arriving soon, so be alert and be ready. Steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long, stay here. So this meaning was get ready to attend a secret worship service, or the time has finally arrived. We're getting out of here, escaping the plantation tonight. And then, of course, there's wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. God's going to trouble the water. And you have to understand that when you escape and are attempting to connect to the next relay point on the Underground Railroad, you have to make sure that you wade through the water to throw the bloodhounds off your scent. And that was a safety thing. Of course, water was an important symbol in the lives of these enslaved Africans because so many of them had spent months on the waters during the Middle Passages, and many of them didn't survive that Middle Passage. Now, Couldn't Hear Nobody Pray. This song is particularly interesting. It meant an escape attempt had failed, and we're all trying to regroup emotionally and spiritually. So when it talks about way down yonder by myself, couldn't hear nobody pray, I mean that something went wrong. So you need to kind of get back to normal here. So I'd like for you to take a listen. This is the Wiley College Choir in Marshall, Texas. And it's a recording they made for the movie, The Birth of a Nation, with Nate Parker playing the role of Nat Turner. Whoops, let me do it.
Oh Lord.
For me, this is almost like a whole body experience. I just can't sit here and be still. I have to move, and their movements show the dynamics of the spirituals. Um, it's Notice the use of the feet and how that created the sound of the drums, basically. And that's still a Gullah tradition in South Carolina. To this day, there are groups that still use the sticker with the drum. But after the Stonewall Rebellion in 1739 in South Carolina, the use of drums was prohibited by Africans from being used. So they had become more creative. The extensive use of spirituals in the struggle for freedom during slavery left a deep imprint on the cultural memory of African Americans and their allies. It's therefore not surprising that during the 1960s and 70s, many of the freedom songs sung by multiracial group of civil rights workers were essentially new versions of old slave spirituals with updated lyrics that express the specific needs of the spiritual rights movement. Dr. Vincent Harding would always say, a movement's gotta have songs, otherwise it's not gonna go anywhere. So the original spiritual Woke Up This Morning with My Mind Stayed on Jesus became Woke Up This Morning with My Mind Stayed on Freedom. Go Tell It on the Mountain that Jesus Christ was born became Go Tell It on the Mountain to Let My People Go. Keep Your Hands on the Plow, Hold On, became Keep Your Eyes on the Prize, Hold On. Over My Head, I See Jesus in the Air, became Over My Head, I See Freedom in the Air. So why do these songs from the spiritual touch so many people? Why are they still important? And I think it's because all of us deal with the same issues deep down at the cellular level. It's way beyond the illusion of race. We are part of the same human family that must be reconciled. The spirituals represent a triumphant spirit from a people that survived and dealt with the most horrible conditions that could ever be imagined. The spirituals help us see the world in a completely different way. They help open the spirit. They help recalibrate humanity, heal the soul. We use them as a vehicle to connect with each other. They allow us to sing with the ancestors like a time machine. Just think about those people who work in those fields, sing these songs, their hands were in the soil. The vibrations got transferred into the soil. And so I think about the possibility that as we work with our hands in the soil today, those vibrations are still there and we feel them. They're coming back from Mother Earth. And when we're singing, we use both our left and our right brains. They make the sky our floor and provide a legacy for infinity. So this is just sort of a brief overview from my perspective of the meaning of spirituals. And I thank you for listening, and I'm gonna turn it over to Adam now.
Thanks, Harold, and I hope you all can hear me a-okay. I'm up in my office at Montview right now, and there might be some construction noise that sneaks in the background, but I think they might all be going on their lunch break right now, so hopefully that timing works out well. Before I kind of launch into my bit, I just have to say it's a real honor and privilege to share this call with Harold. I am probably one of the few people in the Park Hill neighborhood that didn't know Harold up until a few days ago, and I'm very glad to make his acquaintance. And I have to say, having sat through many presentations about spirituals and stuff, Harold just unloaded a lot of knowledge on everyone here in a short amount of time. It's a brief presentation, but it was packed with content. So thanks, Harold, for sharing this call with me and you did just yeoman's work there, getting all that stuff expressed in such a quick amount of time. Um, my purpose on being on the call today is to share with you this reparations royalty project idea that I came up with, and that was um, a part of this NPR story that Sonia was mentioning at the top of the call. And unlike Harold, I'm not sitting here with a big outline and a very well thought out presentation, because I instead thought it'd be a little bit better to just speak anecdotally and just about my kind of personal journey to coming up with this idea. I find that it's helpful for people for us to just hear how I came to it, as opposed I don't like to necessarily profess some kind of like, oh, this is what we have to do, or moral superiority, or kind of bludgeon people with an idea. I think it's better to kind of understand the way that we got there, and some of the reasons, and their reasons I feel strongly about. I don't want anyone to immediately become defensive or feel like they're being bludgeoned with, like I said, some ideas. So let me just share with you a little bit about my background. I'm from upstate New York, if you're wondering where my accent is from. And I grew up there, son of a couple of lawyers that are really not musical whatsoever. But for whatever reason, I had some kind of ear to music, and played piano growing up, and started to fall in love with improvised music and jazz music, especially as I approached my high school years, and was curious about it, but didn't give it much thought in the context of our racial history as a country, right? Somebody would bring me a Miles Davis CD, and I'd listen to a Miles Davis CD, and somebody would bring me a Oscar Peterson CD. I listened to an Oscar Peterson CD, but not really ever thinking much about it, other than just knowing that I loved the music, and also I had, for whatever reason, pretty early on, a sense of what was being done authentically and what was being done inauthentically. And I don't know why I was able to pick that up, but it was always important for me to, when I would play any kind of music, but jazz in particular, for it to be authentic. I didn't want to sound like well, I guess we'll say a poser or something like that, for lack of a better term. So that continued on through college, and I was able to have some really wonderful opportunities. A story I like to share is that I had a black male professor at Carnegie Mellon who I was particularly fond of. He was my solfege teacher, sight singing teacher, and there's lots of stories around that. But at any rate, he was asked to music direct an equity production of The Wiz in downtown Pittsburgh at the Byham Theater, with Billy Porter as the director. And he wasn't available to do the job, and he recommended me for the position. When he was talking to the producer, he said, well, I've got this student. He doesn't look like he can play that kind of music, but he can play that kind of music. And I took that as the highest compliment, because it felt like, all right, I'm doing something right here. And it was a wonderful experience in that I remember looking around the cast before we brought the full band in. And I realized as I was sitting there running the rehearsals or playing piano, I think Billy was more running the rehearsals at this point, that I was only one of two white men in the entire production. And it was a real gift to be, brought into that community. And I guess it made me start to realize that music was affording me some opportunities that maybe other white guys my age weren't being afforded, right? My community was was really broadening in a way that it certainly wasn't broadening just living in a suburb of upstate New York where I grew up. So that's kind of continued to be the case over these years. When I began church work, again, I didn't really give it much thought. I just knew, okay, whether it be gospel, jazz, spirituals, that music was important to me. So I felt like it should be part of my church work. So I've always, included those pieces, whether it's with choir or just with the congregation sings, and wanting it to be authentic, but not necessarily ever going that next step. Authentic probably in just performance practice, but not giving much thought, as Harold was mentioning, like, okay, where did the spirituals really come from? Knowing that they were written by enslaved people, but never giving much thought to the coded messaging or the real intention behind it. And as I grew, a little bit of that would come in, certainly, but still not a ton, right? So I guess that's kind of where I was up until about 2.5 years ago. And I guess 2 years ago, right? So 2020 and the summer of 2020. And I, like a lot of folks in this country, obviously, had this reckoning, right, that we all experienced during the murder of George Floyd and what happened after that. For me, that obviously triggered a lot of thoughts and emotions. In some ways, I was even more moved to self-examination by what happened to the gentleman in Central Park. If you remember that episode with the woman who was calling the police on him. He was, I think, bird watching or something to that effect. And that to me was even more mind-boggling. Of course, it wasn't nearly as tragic of an ending, but here was a person and this woman that was from the Northeast, that was giving to a lot of the same political campaigns that I was giving to. I'm sure it was reading a lot of the same websites I was reading, and was engaging in clearly racist behavior. There's no other way to put it. And it kind of made me step back and think, okay, what kind of latent racist tendencies are there that have come pre-baked into me? So simultaneous to that, our program staff here at Montview began a anti-racism workshop training through Next Church. I don't know if anybody on the call has heard of Next Church, but it's through the Presbyterian Church USA. And it's kind of I don't know if you want to call it a think tank, collaborative type effort. I think they're based in Kansas, actually, but they do a lot of programming, nationwide programming. And their idea is like, what's next for mainline Protestant church, right? What's the future of the church? And they do a lot of great work pushing the church forward in these social justice areas, in these inclusivity areas. And they offered up this anti-racism workshop, and we signed up for it. And it was fabulous, fabulous program. I can't say how much I got out of it. It was 6 sessions over 6 months. Each session lasted about, maybe about 2.5 hours each. And it was started off in a large group, kind of about the size where we are right now, about 45 people, for 45 minutes with a main facilitator. And then he broke down into smaller groups for another 45 minutes. With a couple of facilitators. And then from there, you also had these one-on-one coachings. My coach was a woman by the name of Leanne Hodges out of the Washington, D.C. area. And on our first coaching, I explained to her very much, very similar to what I just explained to you about my background. And, I was wondering, okay, what is next for me? I've been afforded a nice opportunity through music to connect with people who look different than me and have different backgrounds than me. And I like to think I've created some authentic relationships through that. But what are the next steps that I should be taking? And she was fabulous. She went right there with me and she said, hey, you head up a big music program in a church. Have you thought about reparations? And I said, well, yeah, I have thought about reparations. I think that's a fine idea, but isn't that something that the government should do? And never really seen, the hammering is getting closer, but hopefully you can still hear me okay. Never really thinking that there is an individual opportunity to do that. I felt like, okay, if it comes through on a ballot, I'll vote for it. I'll support the government, but never really seen it as a grassroots type of thing. So I give her all the credit for putting that idea in my brain and encouraging me to think about it. And shortly thereafter, maybe been the next session or something like that, I came to her and I said, well, I've got this idea about what if we were to essentially charge a reparations royalty for every time we sing a piece of music in worship. And I wasn't quite sure I wanted to limit it to spirituals, but certainly spirituals would be more than deserving of such a royalty. But I also saw this idea of potentially extending it beyond spirituals to other composers of color, or perhaps even any music that is inspired by the spirituals. And a thing that I came to learn that I think we have a issue with in this country, and I don't speak for all of us, but maybe I speak in a general term because I think there's a lot of smart folks on this call. But I think generally our country needs to get real with its history. And a big part of that is understanding how much this country owes to its Black citizens for making this country what it is. And I think music, especially American music, is the perfect example of that. Now, when you were listening to what Harold was playing there, the last clip he played of Couldn't Hear Nobody Pray, I suspect that a lot of us were obviously moved by that performance, really enjoyed that performance, or were touched by that performance. But I also suspect that it didn't necessarily sound unusual to us, right? It probably touched us because it sounds like us in a way. And the way that our brains work when we listen to a piece of music, okay, is that our brains are always like a step or two ahead, meaning like a few milliseconds ahead of where we are in the music, right? And if the brain sets an expectation of what's to come next, and if what happens with the music is what our brain expects to happen with the music, then we get these really pleasurable sensations. The synapses start firing off and we enjoy the piece of music. This is why you can listen to a piece of music 300 times and not tire of it. You can do it over and over and over again. It's that experience in your brain of that, the brain's always a little bit ahead. So when we sit here in the year 2022, we have this experience of the spirituals. Our brain is anticipating what's next, and the spirituals pay off, right? They fit our expectation. Now, is that because we're all experts about the spirituals? No. The reason is because the spirituals are the primary inspiration, creation of American music. You see, jazz, blues, gospel, rock and roll, they all grew out of this. Now, they're not wholly inspired by the spirituals. Of course, there's other inspirations, but they are mainly inspired by the spirituals. You know, Dvorak, we're familiar with Dvorak, the composer, right? Well, you know, he lived in New York City for about 10 years. And that's where he wrote his New World Symphony, his Ninth Symphony. And, you know, at that point in our musical history, right, there was no American sound. There was no there were composers from America, but you could not tell them apart at all from their Western European counterparts, right? It was all kind of mimicking this Western European sound. And there were people, you know, now that America was becoming older and older, right? 130 years old at this point, that we're starting to wonder, what is the American sound? Now, Dvorak, you know, his compositions were rooted in Czech folk music. So he saw the importance of using his nationality's folk music to inspire his work. And he essentially would tell anyone who would listen, if you're looking for what American folk music is, it is the spiritual. This is wholly original to America and rich with artistry and depth. I mean, he understood it. And this is why when you listen to the New World Symphony, the second movement, right, the Going Home movement is essentially a melody inspired by spirituals. And it's funny. So you think for something that's been so crucial to the development of our major element of American creative output, artistry, you'd think we'd all get this at this point in the year 2022, right? But this is somehow news to us. I mean, it's news. It's kind of like, it was almost like news to me when I started thinking about it and realizing it. And I'm a professional musician, right? You think of all the people, I should be realizing this from the get-go. You know, this should be class number 1 at music conservatory. You know, and don't get me started there, because we still have a very Western Eurocentric way of running our music conservatories in this country. So anyway, so I started to realize that, kind of pivoting now back to this idea of the reparations royalty, is that there's essentially 2 opportunities here, right? There's an opportunity for us to put our money where our mouth is, the big kind of financial contribution element to it. But there's also an element of education. And I think that, you know, I'm not trying to say the money isn't important and it needs to be done, but sometimes, especially those of us that have certain means, can just kind of write a check and forget about it, you know? And the constancy, the discipline of going through a year or more of understanding and recognizing and appreciating and giving every single time you sing a spiritual, or you can go beyond that, like I said. And I feel like the discernment process is a really important step that all faith communities should take. Then you start to realize how much this music is part of us. And I know that might come off a little strange as saying, oh, well, this is a white guy sitting here saying it's part of us. But as Americans, this is it. The spirituals are our folk music. We owe so much to this art form. We owe this art form the integrity, you know, that a music director will bring to performing Bach and Handel. You know, as an American, you need to look at those spirituals and bring even more integrity than you do to Bach and Handel, right? Which is not to say that Bach and Handel isn't great music, but it's not our music. Anyway, I can get going for a little while about this. Let me just kind of close, and then I think I think we're going to probably open up to some questions and such. Um, where we left off with things, we finished up the anti-racism training, and like I said, this had this really great connection with Leanne, my coach, through that. And then she said, I'd like to introduce you to a few people I know who might be interested in your idea, Adam. And one of the persons she introduced me to is Brian Henn. And Brian Henn is the director at the Center for Congregational Song. It's kind of an outreach to the Hymn Society. And Brian took to the idea immediately and was just a great collaborator and really was able to use his network and his connections to start to broadcast this idea to a more national audience. We put together a few different focus groups. And then from that grew out this pilot program that they launched late fall last year. And if you, I think Deanna may have linked it in one of the newsletters, but there's a website that you can go to at the Center for Congregational Song. And an easy way to find it if you can't access that newsletter is you just Google Center for Congregational Song Reparations, and it will come up. It should be the top hit on your Google search. And that website essentially is this kind of discernment tool for congregations or different faith communities to become involved in a reparations royalty pilot program. And that's essentially where I took it with Brian and the Center for Congregational Song. I held off on starting things right up here at Montview right away because obviously COVID, and we were undergoing a pretty major construction campaign here. And I felt as though it was important because of the educational piece. I didn't want it just to be a check that we were writing. I really wanted to make sure we had the educational piece. I felt it important that we have a little bit more of a normal worshiping life here at Montview before we began our own journey with the reparations royalty. So now we are returning to normal, and we're in fact we're having a choir board meeting about it tomorrow, and a worship and music and the arts meeting about it Tuesday, and we have begun our discernment process. And we're actually going to use the center's tool, the website that Sonia's putting in the chat, as a way of going through that, because I think Brian did a fantastic job putting that tool together. And, of course, I have my own ideas, but I think it's also important for the stakeholders involved to, feel ownership and, go through their own discernment process. So, my hope is that we'll go through that and not spend too much time, despite the fact we're Presbyterians, on that endeavor, and begin our reparations royalty program here at Montview, hopefully not too long after Easter. Hopefully by May we are starting. So that's where we're at, and I really thank you for listening to some of my thoughts about that.
Thank you so much, Adam and Harold, for this wonderful presentation. At this time, did Harold and Adam, do you want to talk a little bit amongst yourselves with any ideas that came out of this presentation, or should we open it up to questions from the group? Let's see, you're muted, Harold.
I am muted, and now I'm not muted. I'm very appreciative of Adam's journey, and I think it's important for us to all spend time getting to know each other's journeys, because one of the things that's happened in America is that we're so isolated from each other, and we don't know our backstories. And when you get to know a person's backstory, then you begin to understand why they feel the way they do, and you can say, well, that's okay. That makes all the sense in the world. But what we do in sharing stories is that we keep putting more puzzle pieces together. We are born with a few pieces of the puzzle, but we don't even have the puzzle box in front of us to know how they're supposed to fit. and somebody brings a piece to you and it doesn't fit, so you might say, oh, throw that away, that's crazy, it doesn't mean anything. But as we grow older, we begin to realize that if somebody brings me a piece of the puzzle that won't fit, maybe I'll put it off to the side and I'll be able to connect it later on. So what reason why I'm saying that is that when it comes to the relationship we have with each other along racial lines, we need to share our stories and get to know each other's backgrounds. And so thank you for sharing that with me, with all of us, Adam, really.
Yeah, you're welcome, Harold. Yeah, thanks for that. And I feel like I love that puzzle analogy. Is just fantastic. I might have to use that and credit you, of course, at a later time. I think that's a brilliant way of looking at it. I've always kind of thought that we're all born into where we are, right? There's nothing that we could have done to make that any different. But it's about it's about that journey in which and the decisions you make moving forward. Yeah, but Harold, I'm real glad that you showed some pictures from the National Museum of African American History. I think I still have yet to be there, but I was thinking, oh, we're going in June, and realizing, I've got to make sure that's on my list to go there. And the slide you showed about the economic impact of slavery is just mind-boggling. Like you think but then you see those numbers and you go, whoa.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things that when you talked about the Central Park, the bird watcher, we have a culture that has grown up as a result of white supremacy, that is a culture of hubris and arrogance and fantasies of omnipotence. People can do whatever we want, whenever we want, to whoever we want, and there'll be no consequences. We're seeing this played out over and over again on steroids today. And a lot of people were thinking, I thought we solved that problem decades ago. But no, it's always been there, because it is the kind of culture that we have created. And when just to say a little bit about reparations, the organization and the funds that I'm head of, we seek to create a culture of repair. And that we recognize that reparations is a spiritual concept. When you think about chattel slavery, it's different than the other kinds of slavery, because death is the only way out of chattel slavery. Chattel slavery means that your children and your children's children are born into slavery, and you're considered property and can be bought and sold like cattle. And so it is an unacknowledged crime against humanity. And when you have a crime against humanity, there are things that must be done to repair that. And in our society, money is a deity. And so when we think about reparations, the first thing people go to is, how much money is that going to cost? And I never owned any slaves. And why should I pay for something that happened a long time ago? But we have deified money. But what we really need to do is to be able to see the humanity and the divinity in each one of us, and then work to repair the harms and put the energy into that.